So welcome everyone. I will try to handle the stressy chat simultaneously. Let me just share the screen here. Okay, can you all see the screen? Perfect. All right, so welcome. I don't know how much time I have, and I hope we can have some discussion. So I'm just gonna start right off. The topic for today is Costa Rica's forest transition. I know many of you have heard me talk about this for a while or have done research on this topic. Also on Costa Rica's forest transition, not only just on forest transitions. So for those of you who didn't have that much experience in this topic, when we talk about forest transitions, we obviously have to talk about deforestation first. So deforestation, as it is defined in the literature, deforestation means a permanent conversion of forest to other land use. So logging, even if it is pretty harsh, or let's say if it's a clear cutting, where you remove all the trees in certain areas, if you don't formally change the land use, this would not count as deforestation, right? So it's really important that we understand that logging is a different thing than deforestation. If we go more into the FAO definition, then deforestation can also mean the long-term reduction of tree canopy cover below a certain percentage. And the FAO definition of forest is that it has to be a certain area of, I think it's 2 hectares now, with at least 10% of canopy cover. So anything below that 10% would be counted as deforestation if that reduction is permanent or long-term. And forest transition refers then to this process over time where a certain area, a country or a region goes from having forest cover to reduced forest cover through deforestation, and then moving through a certain point, which in the literature we call it the transition point, from which onwards the forest area increases again. So this is a, you could argue if it's really a U-shaped curve, but it's kind of a U-shaped curve if we look at forest cover over time. And this is something that has happened in mostly developed countries, which were obviously the ones that deforested early on in their development their own forests, and also started to deforest forests in the rest of the planet. So you had several countries in Europe, US, China also, where it seems like forest covers are coming back, are growing. And some few tropical countries have been observed to have now passed through a forest transition as well. And Costa Rica is one of them. Sorry. So the question then is, how is that explained? How can we explain this strange and rather positive, seems like it, at least positive process, right? So we have, normally we are bombarded with these images of deforestation, and we're losing X amount of forest per year, per day, per minute. So this process of a forest transition seems to give us hope, and is therefore very interesting and important to understand, right? So again, in the literature, there are certain ways to explain this, and I'm generalizing a bit here because I don't want to go too much into detail, but there's some authors who claim that there is one forest transition theory, others say that we have a bundle of theories. Both of these authors agree mostly that two of the main theories could be called economic development pathway and the forest scarcity pathway. And I will go over these in a very brief way. So again, remember while we're talking about this, that this is just a theory, and there can be a lot that we can discuss or criticize these theories, but I will just present the theories first. So the economic development pathway is basically a version of modernization theory, right? So that you have an impact at the beginning, you know, when a society starts to develop. Deforestation is linked to processes of, you know, establishing a state, a territory. So sovereignty is claimed by clearing forest and making it visible that the state has control over this area. Similarly, at the very beginning of development of any society, there's, you know, thought to be at least an advance in science and technology, which allows population to increase, right? So we have scientific understandings, we have technology that is being developed in different fields, which in theory, again, causes a decline in mortality and an increase in population. And that is thought to be obviously directly linked to deforestation, because we need to feed these increasing populations, right? The increasing size of population. Similarly, when the society enters the industrialization phase, there will be a higher demand for land, for resources, for timber also. And that is again linked to increases in deforestation. So think about mining, think about increasing the agricultural frontier, producing more and more stuff, which needs minerals. There's mining happening, logging, and other types of natural resources that are required for this process that cannot be linked to deforestation increases. Then there's, when we look at the agricultural side, so, and this is one that is highly debated in the literature. So when we become more efficient in growing food, under the original forest transition theory, this meant that being more efficient, we could produce enough food on less and less land, right? So if we are more efficient in producing food, we don't need to deforest other areas because we can produce more food on the land that is already cleared. Like I said, and I don't want to go too deeply into that, this part has been questioned a lot. When something becomes more efficient, what we see in reality oftentimes is that then this actually leads to an increase of the consumption of certain resources. In this sense, when agriculture becomes more efficient, deforestation increases because we can produce more and more. And that is the problem with our economic system, of course, that we are basically forced to increase production whenever we can and through however means we can. Again, under this economic development pathway, when there is a new form of employment, there's a new sectors of the economy are appearing. This means that in this theory that people will tend to move towards these new jobs. So if there's an industrialization, there's a tendency then that people move from the rural areas towards the urban areas where there are more, let's say, better paid jobs or more stable jobs. And that, under this theory, then means that less people will live in the rural areas, reducing pressure on the forests. Again, this is very highly debated. Not necessarily having less people in the rural areas means automatically less deforestation, right? So you can have, for example, industrial agriculture moving into these regions. They would be very happy actually with people wanting to leave the rural areas, and then let's say pineapple plantations can take over all the land that was used to be in the hands of small-scale farmers. Anyway, in this theory, we have industrialization, new jobs coming, people move from the rural to the urban, and that creates less deforestation. It's linked to that then, so this whole process of urbanization and also the increase in the education level will reduce or is reducing fertility rates and therefore decelerates growth in population. So here we are coming now to the point where we have already moved through a forest transition at this level. So we have population decrease, we have people moving away from rural areas, we have industrial activities that are now becoming more and more service-based economic activities, and all these would reduce the demand for deforestation. So this is how, under this pathway, the transition itself is being explained. With time and with GDP growth or per capita GDP growth, it is said also that people then have the luxury to care about the environment, right? So if you have a society where more and more people don't have to worry about getting food on their table or paying their bills, then they will be in a situation where they can ask for, demand a healthy environment, healthy nature from their state, from their governments. So this is when you see then the appearance of new organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs that deal with conservation. You see the state establishing protected areas, etc., etc. So as you can see, this whole, especially this pathway of the forest transition theory is very much linked to the environmental Kuznets curve theory. For those of you, again, who maybe don't remember so much about this theory, it's coming from a Kuznets curve observation. I don't know if you call it theory, but the Kuznets curve originally was the result of a research of this guy Kuznets, who studied or who observed how in societies over time social inequality started to increase, and then at a certain transition point started to decrease. So if we move that model or that observation to the environment, some people from the environmental, I think it was environmental economics, maybe ecological economics, realized that some environmental indicators would follow a similar process. So you had environmental degradation going up, right? At a certain point of development, of economic growth, these environmental impacts would start to go down again. And again, without getting too deep into that, because we could have a whole session on this curve alone, there are some problems with this model, right? So like I said, first of all, it's a theory. It's not necessarily true for many indicators, at least environmental indicators, it's not true. It also kind of forgets that we're living in a globalized economy, right? So whatever happens in one country doesn't mean that it happens in all countries. Whatever happens in one region or country can have impacts in other parts of the country or of the world. And again, a big problem with these kind of theories is that they lead people to confuse correlation with causation. So only because you can see that something is correlated doesn't mean that one causes the other, right? And that is very important, because if you confuse these things, then you can come pretty quickly to the conclusion that basically we don't need to worry about deforestation or environmental degradation. We just need to have patience, and we need to focus all our policies and our attention on more economic growth. Because economic growth under this theory seems to be, like I said, if you don't understand the difference between causation and correlation, economic growth seems to be responsible for an increase and later on a decrease in environmental degradation. We now pretty much know that economic growth is one of the main underlying causes of climate change and of any other global environmental change issue that we are aware of. So that is, for me, one of the big dangers of forest transition theory under the economic development pathway, that it might lead people to understand to conclude the wrong things. The second pathway that is most visible in the forest transition theory is this forest scarcity pathway. This way, it's much shorter and much less complex, I guess. So society at the community level or at the national level, doesn't matter. A group of people, a community realizes that the lack of forest and the lack of services coming out of those areas are felt, and the impacts of deforestation are felt and create, let's say, a process of demanding from the state or demanding a change in attitude, in action. It demands a change, basically. So you can, like it says here, mostly they're talking about pressure on the government. It can also be the government itself realizing that this is happening and therefore acting before civil society even moves politically to force them to act. It can be a community reacting to the impacts without needing to go through the government. But so it's a reaction, it's a reactive process that stops deforestation and begins with, for example, restoration and reforestation of certain areas, and then forest areas increase again. So when we look at Costa Rica as an example, how can we explain, or how can these theories be applied to the Costa Rican case, and how can the Costa Rican case inform these theories? So first of all, this is a bit older already, the map of Costa Rica's forest cover. There are certain things that I would like to point out. Obviously, as you can see, the forest area from 1940s to 1987, it's very clear how the forest area is reduced in those years. You can also see the big change between 1987 and 1997, right? And the big change that I mean is not simply an increase in forest cover, but an increase in the detail of the forest fragments that we are seeing in this image. So there's definitely something going on here, right? So we have higher levels of technology. The images that are being taken in the late 1990s are very different from the ones in the 1950s, obviously. Anyway, this is the official map from the agency that is in charge of running the Payment for Environmental Services program in Costa Rica. It's part of the Ministry of Environment. Again, this is a topic that I really, I have to be careful not to get too deep into it at this moment. But the point is that there are, in the literature nowadays, there's a lot of debate about, is this really true what we see here? And some of the most prominent researchers who have been studying forest cover dynamics in Costa Rica are actually saying that Costa Rica never went below 40% of forest cover, which is a good thing, but it also makes the supposed success of Costa Rica in having gone through a forest transition much less special, I guess, or less extreme. The fact is that Costa Rica has gone through a forest transition and the national forest cover is stable, at least since 2010. There is still some deforestation on small scales, but there's also other areas where you have an increase in forest cover. So net deforestation is close to zero. So just briefly then, I want to talk about 3 different stages that are linked to forest cover dynamics in Costa Rica. So before the 1970s, we definitely had high levels of deforestation. The picture on the right is obviously not a forest in Costa Rica. Anybody who has been in the tropics knows that. This looks more like a, I don't know, German or Canadian or... Anyway, it looked kind of nice. So the problem with deforestation, not only in Costa Rica, but throughout the tropics and throughout the world really, was that deforestation was not seen as something negative, right? Deforestation meant actually progress. So forest was seen as something worthless, something that was in the way of development. We had to clear forests to make the land usable, to make the land profitable. Sometimes we needed even to claim a right to the land, we had to clear it first. So that again explains also why maybe in the past deforestation wasn't really measured that efficiently or effectively because nobody really cared about it, right? It wasn't seen as a problem. Later on in the 1980s, people started to realize that there was a problem, right? So again, depending on where you look, Costa Rica is often mentioned as having been one of the countries with one of the highest deforestation rates on the continent, sometimes even in the world, which I still doubt. But there was a lot of attention on Costa Rica and how to stop deforestation. So Costa Rica reacted in the 70s and 80s by creating national parks, by creating a whole system of conservation areas, increasing and establishing regulations for logging, and also already playing with or experimenting with the first economic incentives in order to make people change their behavior, right? So to reforest or to protect forests that were still there through economic incentives. At that time, monitoring and implementation of these regulations was very weak. There was also issues of corruption in certain instances, but at least the attention was on deforestation as a problem. And it wasn't until the 1990s, specifically 1996, when Costa Rica created its Forestry Law 75/75, that had very serious consequences for the topic of deforestation and forest cover change. So this law created the current national system of conservation areas, a decentralized system that took the whole country and basically created regional offices of the environmental ministry to oversee all natural resource management throughout the country. Deforestation was made illegal, which is not so common as some people might think. It's an important law. It was very hard to actually pass this. And some say that the PES program, the Payment for Environmental Services program, was kind of like it was established for the reason, of course, because we were in the 1990s where market-based approaches to conservation were pretty much the rule, and the World Bank and other US aid and all these were trying hard to implement market-based conservation and trying to create Costa Rica as a success story of this kind of conservation. But others say that it was also kind of a, I'm forgetting the word right now, but was like a counterbalance to this harsh new law that prohibited deforestation. So we have to compensate forest owners because we are telling them that they cannot touch their forests. So they should get compensated. So and in the schematic on the right, you see that kind of like in urban or whoever benefits from environmental services pays to these landowners who protect their forests and provide ecosystem services to the downstream ecosystem service users. That was the logic of this. And again, I will not go too deeply into that because again, we can have a long conversation about the PES program in itself. Today, we have a situation where, like I said, the forest area is stable. The payment for environmental service system is still functioning. We have a stable or even increasing forest area. So definitely, there's no doubt about Costa Rica being one of the few tropical countries that have been going through a forest transition. Like I said, there are some areas in Costa Rica where you still have deforestation happening, mostly because of agricultural expansion. So we're talking about pineapple, sugarcane, banana plantations that are still pushing into, on a much smaller scale than before, of course, but still pushing into some forest areas, while on other parts of the country, you have forests increasing constantly, forest areas increasing. There's a lot of work being done from the state, but also from very important NGOs that are working on forest restoration in all parts of Costa Rica, really. So briefly, what happened in Costa Rica over the last few decades is that, we have in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we've been going through some very serious structural adjustment programs. In general, the economy has moved from an economy based on agriculture to an economy based on services. So in part, we have followed what was described as the economic development pathway. These structural adjustment programs, mostly in this sense, when we talk about forest cover, had the impact that subsidies and any economic incentives for small-scale agriculture were taken away, meaning that for many people in Costa Rica, agriculture became less and less profitable. We can see here on this right graph the total agricultural land in percentage of total land area in Costa Rica. So it moved from, again, it increased up to a certain point in the middle of the 1980s and then decreased and stabilized around 35% after the year 2000. This is very important because it shows, it's a mirror image of what used to be forest cover in Costa Rica. So the graph would be obviously the other way around, like a U curve. Forest cover is going down until the mid 80s and then started to increase. I have a graph on that later on, or we can go back to that. Another interesting data that I found, the total urban versus total rural workforce in Costa Rica. So this is from the 1990s all the way to 2015. You can see here that at some point, the urban workforce, the urban amount of numbers working in urban areas passed the rural urban workforce, the rural workforce, sorry. So again, is this significant or not? I don't know. It just shows that rural jobs or the amount of people working in rural areas has been going down while other sectors have been going up. Here's the forest cover in percentage as well of Costa Rica according to World Bank. And here I just have to make a short explanation. So if you remember the graph on this one here, the peak of agricultural land is in the 1980s. The lowest point of forest area in percentage, according to the World Bank, was in the year 2000. This is very interesting because when I began to look at these statistics back in, I guess, 2014, there was a different data set on the World Bank website where the lowest point, so the transition point of forest cover in Costa Rica, was before 1990. But then they changed it, and now it seems like, according to World Bank, which takes the data from the FAO, the forest transition has moved to the year 2000, which can have different explanations. Again, I'm not going into that debate, but just showing you that this is a clear indication of a forest transition, right? Interesting here is that you can see, according to this data, the percentage of land area that was under forest cover never went below 46%, which is, again, very, very different from the graph that I showed at the beginning, where the lowest forest cover was established at 21%. And yes, the year 2000, I already talked about that. So how does Costa Rica explain this phenomenon? How does Costa Rica explain the success of stopping deforestation and having gone through a forest transition? Most visible in, let's say, non-academic media, in publications that are for the general public, let's say, people mention the PES program. There's also obviously a lot of, let's say, I don't know how to express it, like politically, it was important to use this to make Costa Rica look better, right? So you see a lot of language that hints at almost nationalistic stuff, like Costa Ricans are more green, we are a country that is just environmentally conscious, and other things like that. But the most visible ones that I can take seriously, at least, are these two, right? So the payment for environmental services program and the prohibition of land use change. So the making deforestation illegal throughout the country. Those two things are often mentioned as the main ones. Surprisingly, the second one is not as common as the first one. And for me, that means that, again, the market-based conservation approaches are still being promoted or have been promoted as the most important until very recently. Another graph that I found interesting, or another issue on socioeconomic changes or dynamics, is, like I said, that the economy has moved towards a service-based style economy, right? So we have tourism, we have high-tech industry, we have medical equipment being the most important exports and the most important issues in our economy versus a few decades ago where it was all agriculture. The GDP per capita has increased pretty much constantly, with a little flattening here during the last economic crisis, global crisis. But yeah, we have moved from an agricultural economy towards a service-based economy. Here, just again, this is not really important, but looking at the amount of the importance of exports from these newer things, 45%, 46% 47% actually, of all the exports are coming only from these first two. This is not really that important. I just want to show that there has been a move towards a diversification of the economy, and some of these newer things have become prominent, right? So in Costa Rica's forest transition, we can say that, and this is again based on some research that I did, but also on literature that, you know, we don't have the time to go in all these details, but basically we can say that both pathways of the forest transition theory are present, right? We have regions in the country where people reacted to the lack of forests, to the lack of environmental services. We had very visible impacts, erosion. Erosion is one of the big ones, losing soil in many parts of Costa Rica where agriculture was one of the main means of livelihood, and then were simply not possible anymore. People started to realize that deforestation was actually not beneficial. And also with the appearance of tourism, people changed to their vision about what it means to have a healthy ecosystem. So there was an incentive to reforest very quickly. Also the development pathway, obviously, we've had this move towards this other type of economy. So many aspects of that pathway part of the forest transition theory are present in Costa Rica. What was interesting for me was that it's even in a country of this size, like a very small country, we have so much diversity, right? So things happen differently depending on where you look in Costa Rica. Sometimes it was a difference in time. Some areas started the transition much earlier than others, and the drivers of the transition or the theories that can explain these changes are very different depending on where you are in Costa Rica. What is, again, an important aspect, and which is a criticism again to the forest transition theory and to the environmental Kuznets curve theory, is that these theories oftentimes forget that we are living in a globalized world, and that there can be impacts of socioeconomic changes outside of the country that affect what is going on inside the country. So the crisis in the agro sector, which cannot be explained only through the structural adjustment programs, but also simply because of the global market, for example, the price for meat was going down, that we had a crisis of oil as well in the late 70s, remember? No, you can't remember because you weren't born. But so there were many other things happening that impacted or had an influence on forest cover in Costa Rica. Structural adjustment programs were important in that aspect. Definitely not a planned result, right? But interesting how the structural adjustment program was benefiting forest cover recovery, or the increase in forest cover. Obviously, at the same time, they were causing huge problems for many small and medium-sized farmers throughout the region. So another thing that was mentioned often was that, yes, well, in my own research at least, it was mentioned that we had an increase in monitoring and law enforcement capacity. So the SINAC and civil society were taking care of the environment of the forests. So there's a public awareness that can be explained through different things. Like I said, tourism is one, environmental education is another one. But yeah, that was mentioned a lot. An important thing here is, and that is again a huge topic, the type of forest that's coming back is different from the ones that we lost. Right? That is a kind of a downer on this whole positive outlook of a country going through a forest transition. Doesn't mean that the forest quality necessarily is the same, right? I already talked about how we live in a globalized system. So Costa Rica reacted to a change in the global price system, for example, or the boom and bust cycles of certain crops. So that has an impact. This is important when we talk about the permanence or the sustainability of a forest transition. In the future, if things change on the global market, we might have an increase in deforestation again, for example. I already said this last point that we moved from being a rural to being an increasingly urban society, from an economy based on agriculture to one based on services. Again, this is important because it's a change in the economy. It's not necessarily, and I will talk about that in a second, it's not the growth in the economy, it's a change in the economy that is important here. So just to finish then, and this is basically a little criticism or a little nod towards the environmental Kuznets curve interpretation of the forest transition theory, that we have to be very careful with this more and more accepted notion that economic growth is positive for the environment, that it's necessary for having a healthy environment. Okay, when you look at these cases in a more detailed level, it becomes clear that, you know, economic growth is not causing a forest transition, right? So economic growth happens, but in my view, at least from what I have analyzed, economic growth and the forest transition are consequences of this change in the economy, right? So Costa Rica was able to grow economically because it moved into new areas like tourism and high tech, because it was investing in education for a long time, and because the global market around Costa Rica was changing, right? So these global regional changes in the, let's say, economic and social aspects, the new demands for certain products made it possible for Costa Rica to move its economy towards a certain way that demanded less deforestation, right? And like I said before, this incredible diversity of what is going on. So whatever you see at a very local level, you have to make sure you understand most of the processes around it to be able to understand what is going on. So it's very hard to speak about national processes, even in a small country like Costa Rica. And that, again, means that the success of Costa Rica of going through a forest transition is not the result of their own policies only. Yes, the law on prohibiting deforestation is important. Yes, the PES program helped, but it's not the only explanation. It cannot be the only explanation. And therefore, the sustainability or the permanence of this increasing forest area or the stable forest area is not assured. And that's what I have for today. So I don't know, can you guys speak? Are your microphones muted, or do you want to do it through the chat? If you have any questions or comments. Let me just stop sharing. Okay, Utir says he cannot speak. Okay, so based on the Kuznets curve, can we assume that the planet is expecting even more deforestation as the global south is still the pre-industrial? The problem with the Kuznets curve is that it explains what happens in one country, but it doesn't explain how, for example, deforestation can move to other parts, right? So if Costa Rica is successful in stopping deforestation, if Costa Rica stops producing certain crops, if there's less, for example, cattle being raised in Costa Rica, that is a good thing. But on the other hand, it could mean that in other areas, let's say in Nicaragua or in Colombia, for whatever reason, then there will be an increase in cattle raising. And that means that there will be an increase in deforestation. In general, I think we are still far away from a global forest transition point. Yes, there will be more deforestation. We see it already in some countries. I just mentioned Colombia. Colombia is doing many things now after its long civil war or the civil conflict. But it seems that the Amazon region, we always talk about Brazil, but actually in the Colombian Amazon, there's a huge deforestation process going on, all in the name of development. Okay. Okay, nice to hear that you are excited to come to UPs. That's exactly what we wanted with that. Any other comment, question? Okay. So if you have any other question, you can send me an email. I don't know if we can share. I'm just going to put my email here. Okay, here tourism played a role in diversifying the opportunities. Did we see an increase in deforestation during COVID? Okay, excellent question. From what I have seen, I have only been in the Costa Rican south on the Osa Peninsula, just asking these kind of questions lately. I know that in Guanacaste in the north, there has been maybe very small scale, there has been an increase in forest fires, but so to answer your question, there has not been a huge increase in deforestation. I don't even think there has been an increase in deforestation. There has been an increase in illegal logging, maybe. So people cutting trees for timber without changing land use of the area. And there has been an increase in gold mining, which is illegal also. And there has been an increase in poaching. So illegal hunting. Hunting is illegal throughout the country, by the way, but there has been an increase in hunting. And yes, that is a very important topic, I think, and we are actually starting a nice research project on exactly that. How have people managed to survive, or how have their businesses survived over time, during COVID without tourists? So how has ecotourism been affected by COVID, and how has that affected conservation? Excellent question. So you have my email. And I guess we leave it here then, right? Thank you for your participation, for your attention. I hope it wasn't boring, or not too boring at least. And see you guys around, I guess. Yeah.